Part 33. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 322. Royal Palace. All the courtiers in the palace know that His Majesty is diligent in political affairs and spends at least 6 hours every day in the imperial study. However, today, Emperor Chen is rare and does not review memorials in the imperial study. Instead, he walks in the slightly bleak imperial garden. Only the personal eunuch Wei Jian accompanied him. I heard that the princess of Changning in Chu State took part in the imperial examination as a boy. At the age of 17, she passed the 3-level examination. She was also good at both civil and military arts. Although she was born as a girl, it is rare for a man in the world to do so. His looking into the distance, he said, her style even surpasses that of her father. The royal family of Chu State is really full of talents. Wei Jian said with a smile, Your Majesty has forgotten that there are 2 number 1 scholars in our dynasty who have reached the 3rd place. Master Fang and Master Tang both became famous at a young age. They are not far behind Princess Changning. I'm talking about the royal family. Emperor Chen looked away and said, Prince Duan and Prince Kong only know how to fight for power and gain, with mediocre abilities and no sense of responsibility. How can I leave the country in their hands in the future? Wei Jian chuckled and said, Your Majesty is in good health. This country can at least continue in your hands for several decades. The 2 princes are still young and will eventually change. Everyone is tired after sitting on the throne for a long time. Huang Chen sighed and asked, My original intention was to let them compete with each other and grow up with each other. I never thought that they would only focus on the power in front of them. What's more, he actually reached out to the national treasury. Chen Huang gritted his teeth and said with some hatred, it would be fine if he admitted it openly and openly. As a hero, he should have such courage, but he doesn't even dare to admit it. I am extremely disappointed in him. Wei Jian followed Emperor Chen, bowing his head and saying nothing. One person has no courage, and one person will get carried away once he gains power and form a large number of cliques. Are there many tricks these days for the Yashitai to impeach the powerful people in the capital? As Chen Huang spoke, his breathing became heavier and he slapped his hands. On the stone table in the pavilion, he said angrily, I'm not dead yet, what are they all fighting for? Wei Jian hurriedly stepped forward and said, Your Majesty, calm down, calm down. After a while, Chen Huang's breathing returned to calmness and he asked, What is manner doing these days? Wei Jiandao, Her Royal Highness the Princess has been accompanied by Princess Anyang these days and has traveled to many places in the capital. Princess Pingyang Mansion. Zhao Man looked at Princess Anyang and said ostentatiously, Sister Anyang, have you ever fished? I went fishing yesterday and caught a lot. No, Princess Anyang shook her head. The ladies of the capital had their own entertainment methods, and things like fishing were obviously not among them. She looked at Zhao Man and suddenly asked, Who did Sister Pingyang go with? With Tang Ning thinking of what happened yesterday, Zhao Man's eyes turned into crescent moons and she said, He is so stupid. We had a fishing competition yesterday and he didn't catch a single fish. Princess Anyang looked at her with a slightly strange look in her eyes, thought for a moment, and said, Master Tang is a 3rd-level official. He is one of the most intelligent people in the world and has unparalleled strategies. Sister, if you don't want to marry to the Chu state, why don't you let me marry you? He helps you, maybe he has a way to prevent you from getting married. Zhao Man smiled and said, regarding the diplomatic relations between the 2 countries, something that both the father and the court officials agree to, what can he do? Princess Anyang looked at her and said, It's possible. Zhao Man shook his head and said, This is a major matter related to the diplomatic relations between the 2 countries. If he objects, Your Majesty will not tolerate him, and the court will not tolerate him either. She looked at Princess Anyang and said, Actually, I have figured it out these days. I am a princess. It is my destiny to be born in the royal family. It is also my destiny to marry into the Chu kingdom. Princess Anyang looked at her as if she were a stranger. The Pingyang sister who had grown up with her and whom she was no longer familiar with seemed to be no longer the little girl who was born in a deep palace and whose mind was as blank as a piece of paper. She looked away and said, "Actually, Your Majesty loves you very much, but the diplomatic relations between the two countries are serious, and Your Majesty must also put state affairs first." Zhao Man nodded and said, "I don't blame my father." The two sisters talked for a while in the mansion, and then Princess Anyang stood up to leave. Zhao Man walked her to the door. Princess Anyang suddenly looked at her and asked, "I'm going to Chu State soon. I must be very reluctant to leave him, right?" Zhao Man shook his head and said, "You'll be fine if you get used to it." "I haven't said who that person is yet." Princess Anyang looked at her and asked, "Who is my sister talking about?" Zhao Man froze in place, biting her lips and wringing her hands together. "Hey, who is here?" Su Mei was sitting behind a pile of papers in Tian residence. She looked at Tang Ning, who walked in from the door, and said, "Long time no see. You seem to have grown taller." Before Tang Ning could get closer, a smell of resentment hit her face. He didn't come to Tianjia very much these days, mainly after going to the Yamen. Apart from accompanying Xiao Ruxiayi, he spent the rest of the time thinking of ways to make Zhao Man happy. In the last days, as a friend, he hoped to leave her a happy life. Memories. Tang Ning looked at her and explained, "I've been here twice, but you weren't here." Su Mei glanced at him, "Are you here to see your mother or me? Is there a difference?" "There's none." The two of them stared at each other, but Tang Ning couldn't stare at her charming eyes, so she looked away and said, "I came to see you today." A moment later, Su Mei was lying on the bed, and Tang Ning was sitting beside the bed, asking casually, "The Prince of Chu wants to marry Duke Pingyang." This chapter is not finished yet. Please click on the next page to continue reading. This chapter was first published on AIU Voice Novel Network. Please remember the URL. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiaorong. Chapter 323. Remember in 1 second, read wonderful novels for free without pop-ups. 3 days after Tang Ning handed over Ziwan Jilu, the palace received news that Tang Grenzai was ordered to print 1,000 copies first. After printing, the court would send people to distribute them to local government offices. A mere 1,000 copies did not make much profit, but as the first officially authorized bookstore in the capital, this significance could not be replaced by silver. As the first printing bookstore, Tang Grenzai will be responsible for the revision and compilation of Ziwan Jilu in the future, as well as the accompanying case investigation, and 5 years county magistrate 3 years solving cases. Since then, Tang Grenzai has an official background, and if it wants to do something else in the future, the resistance will be much smaller. In addition, with this spring breeze, Tang Grenzai will also launch such public case novels as My Years as the Minister of the Ministry of Justice, Self-Cultivation of a Vice Minister of the Ministry of Justice, and How the God of Detectives Was Made. Among them, the first 2 volumes of My Years as the Minister of Justice have been sold. It tells the story of a minister of justice named Song Si, who, during his tenure, stood up for the people, repeatedly solved strange cases, and fought against various evil forces in the court. It is full of mainstream positive energy and conforms to the core values that the current court has always advocated. There were no such public case novels on the market before, and Tang Ning was worried that this type of book would not sell well. Unexpectedly, the people had great enthusiasm for this new form of public case novels, and even completely reversed the situation that female readers have always occupied half of the sky since the establishment of Tang Grenzai. Tomorrow is a holiday, and the gong sounded. Tang Ning walked out of the Ministry of Justice and saw the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Justice walking out of it. Tang Ning took the initiative to greet him, "Minister Su." Thank you for your hard work in compiling the Zhuangjilu. Minister Su looked at him with a forced smile on his face and said, Minister Tang, take a good rest these days, and put aside the cases in the Ministry of Justice for the time being. Tang Ning cupped his hands, thank you for your concern, Minister Su. In fact, he had not been assigned any cases in the past few days. It seemed that everything was calm, as if nothing had happened. But the more restless it is, the more complicated it is. The Tang family and Prince Duan are already in a precarious situation. If they are not careful, they will become stepping stones for Prince Kang's success. How could they miss such an opportunity? The only possibility is that they are waiting. If they don't strike, they will hit. Calculating the time, they have not made any big moves for so long. It seems that Prince Kang will have to pay a heavy price this time. Goodbye, Minister Su. Goodbye, Minister Tang. After saying goodbye to Tang Ning, Su Cheng's smile disappeared and his face showed a worried look. After deciding to get closer to King Kong, he suppressed many cases in the past few days. However, he initially thought that it would only involve the case of Marquis Yanping, but he did not expect that it was just the beginning. In this way, the risk is much greater than before. But now he can't turn back. If he ignores it, then all his previous efforts will be in vain. For now, he can only follow King Kong and go all the way. Recreation always makes people happy. Perhaps it is because he feels bored with the repetitive life in his previous life. Tang Ning does not like this kind of day of clocking in and out at work every day. Being able to accompany his family every day, walking around, fishing and cooking, even watching Tang Yao Yao jumping up and down with a sword, is much better than calculating all day long. Tang Yajing seemed to be worried today. She was absent-minded when practicing sword, and even Tang Ning saw a few flaws. After a while, she put away her sword and walked over, wanting to say something but stopping. Tang Ning was still trying to figure out what moves he could use to defeat her in her previous state. When he saw her coming over, he raised his head and asked, "Is there something wrong?" "Miss Lianer." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Don't worry, this matter will soon have a result." "That's not what I meant." Tang Yao Yao shook her head and said, "I heard from the princess that those people have a strong background. If you go against them, will there be any trouble?" Tang Ning glanced at her and now knew that she was worried about him. A few days ago, he was indignant and scolded the dog officials of the Ministry of Justice. Whether this happened to their friends or ordinary people, he, as the head of the Ministry of Justice, would not care about it. His conscience would not let it go. However, he would not act on impulse like Tang Yajing, and would not use himself and his family as a gamble. He looked at Tang Yao Yao and said, "At worst, I can just quit being an official. I won't starve to death anyway." Tang Yao Yao's face changed. "Is it that serious?" "Marquis of Yanping, Marquis of Changxing, Earl of Yongchuan, Earl of Huaning, which one of these people is not more powerful than our family, not to mention that they have King Kong behind them? Who else in the court can be more powerful than King Kong?" Tang Yao Yao's face turned pale and asked, "Then, what should we do?" "I don't know." Tang Ning shook his head and said, "King Kong will be the emperor in the future. Even if we win this time, he will retaliate in the future. Demotion is the lightest punishment. There is also the possibility of confiscating the property and exiling." Looking at Tang Yao Yao's pale face, Tang Ning glanced at her, "Are you scared now?" Tang Yao Yao's lips trembled and said, "I'm sorry, I lied to you." Tang Ning couldn't help laughing, looking at her, and said, "Why would I gamble with Xiaoi and the others? Those people will soon pay the price for their actions. You just wait and see." Tang Yao Yao was stunned, took a deep breath, looked at him, and asked, "Is it funny?" Seeing her pinching her knuckles until they creaked, Tang Ning's face was solemn and he said, "Not funny." Tang Yao Yao put his arm around his shoulders and said, "Come to my room, I have something to say to you. Tang Ning grabbed a corner of the stone table and asked, is there anything we can't say here? Tang Yao Yao pried his hands apart and said, it's not good to be here if others see it. See. Here. Tang Ning didn't go anywhere on this day of rest. He accidentally twisted his waist yesterday and couldn't move, so he had to stay at home. Fortunately, Zhao Man didn't come to see him today. Thinking that she didn't come yesterday, he didn't know what she was doing in the mansion. In case she did something crazy, Tang Ning went to find her after dinner. Why are you here? When Tang Ning walked into the room, she looked a little flustered. It was unknown what she was doing just now. Her eyes looked to the side vaguely. If Tang Ning guessed correctly, there should be something there that she didn't want to see. Tang Ning looked at her and said, we are going to listen to the opera tonight. Princess, do you want to go with us? Zhao Man shook her head and said, I'm a little tired and want to rest early. You go. Tang Ning looked at her and finally shook her head and said, then I'll leave. After he left, Zhao Man breathed a sigh of relief and took out the things hidden in the quilt. A maid stepped forward and whispered, Princess, let me do it. What if you get hurt by accident? No need. Zhao Man shook her head and said, anyway, it's only this time. I want to do it myself and give it to him personally. Tang family. It was late at night. Tang Chi walked to the door of a study, knocked on the door, pushed it open and saw Tang Hui sitting inside. After a moment of silence, he asked, is it almost done? Tang Hui thought for a while and said, everything is ready, except for King Kong. Tang Chi said, then I will inform Jing Er. Once the impeachment letter from the censor is submitted, King Kong will have to come forward. Tang Hui nodded. Tang Chi thought for a while and said, Zhou Qing's rank is too low. Even if it is an impeachment, the letter must go through the Shangsha province. Zheng Dong, the left doctor, is in charge of the 6 ministries. He is originally from the line of King Kong. The letter may not be accepted by him. Of course it won't be accepted by him. Tang Hui didn't care at all and said, Zhou Qing is not qualified, but he has a father-in-law who is the imperial censor. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 324. Capital, Wanjiao Tower. Wanjiao Tower is a well-known restaurant in the capital. Although it cannot be compared with the famous Tianrunju, it is also one of the restaurants where the rich and powerful in the capital often gather. The sky was getting dark, and a group of people walked out of Wanjiao Tower. They were greeted by the smell of alcohol. I'm not drunk. I won't come home until I'm drunk today. I can still drink, give me another bottle of wine. Brother Chen, Fang Xiong, Brother Wei is drunk, you two take him back. Several young people dispersed at the entrance of Wanjiao Tower. Tang Jing breathed a sigh of relief, looked at a young man beside him, and said, Brother Zhou, you and I are traveling together, let's go back together. The young man nodded and said, that's very good. Tang Jing walked with him on the street, chatted for a while, and asked casually, I heard that Brother Zhou's job at Yashitai is not bad. The young man named Zhou Qing bowed his hand to him and said, I can't compare with Brother Tang. He was promoted to the head of the household department so quickly. I, a small supervisory censor, am nothing. Tang Jing shook his head and said, you and I are just in different positions. We are officials in the same dynasty and we are all serving His Majesty. How can we be superior? Although Zhou Qing nodded in agreement, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The two were Jinshi in the same year, and now Tang Jing has been promoted to the head of the household department, while he was ranked at the bottom of the B list back then, and could not even make up for a 7th grade county magistrate. If he had not had some connections in the court, he would not have even been promoted. I can't wait for the errand of Yashitai. The Tang family is so high up there that they can't compare to them after all. The two of them walked somewhere, and suddenly there was a commotion in front of them. Tang Jing looked up and said in surprise, "This is in front of the criminal department. Who dares to make trouble here? Brother Zhou, why don't we go and have a look?" Zhou Qing was actually not interested in the commotion ahead, but when Tang Jing spoke, he had no choice but to follow him. When he got closer, he found an old man kneeling on the ground. There seemed to be writing on the rag in front of him. Tang Jing came closer to take a look. After a while, he shook his head and said, "Jingbian Ho is too shameful. Not to mention occupying people's fields. He also allowed his subordinates to beat the common people." The old man's land was taken over by the Jingbian Marquis mansion and his son was beaten to death. He had no place to redress his grievances, so he knelt in front of the criminal department and begged for justice. Is this happening? Zhou Qing was originally a censor. Although he was not a censor of high rank and was not even qualified to go to court, he still had the responsibility of supervising the powerful officials in the capital. Tang Ning looked at him, shook her head and said, "Although Brother Zhou is the censor, Marquis Jingbian is not someone to be taken lightly. Brother Zhou still avoids this kind of thing." Zhou Qing frowned and said, "As a censor, if you are afraid of the powerful, how can you be worthy of the official title on your head? He has been sitting in the position of supervisory censor for a long enough time. If his performance is mediocre all the time, he doesn't know how long it will take if he takes another step forward. A censor who is unwilling to offend others will not be promoted." He glanced at the old man and said, "I will hand over the paper tomorrow to impeach Marquis Jingbian." Tang Jing bowed her hands to him and said, "Brother Zhou is righteous, Tang admires him." After the two left, the old man put away the rags in front of him, walked to an alley, looked around, and asked in a low voice, "Sir, what should the little old man do next?" A voice from the front said, "You don't have to do anything, just stay at home. When the time comes, the court will give you justice." The old man knelt on the ground, touched his head to the ground, and said loudly, "Thank you, sir." Shangsha Province. The Shangsha Province is in charge of documents and provincial memorials. It is the most confidential department among the three provinces. Most of the documents submitted from local or various government offices in Beijing must first go through the Shangsha Province, sorted and classified, and then handed over to the two officials. The Prime Minister will review it, and only some of the secrets will be presented to the Emperor. Even though today's Emperor is extremely diligent, the memorials reviewed by hand only account for a very small part of all memorials. Before being reviewed, the memorials handled by the two prime ministers also had to be screened by the left and right ministers to filter out the irrelevant content. In addition to being responsible for various matters of the Ministry of Personnel, the Ministry of Household Affairs, and the Ministry of Rights, Zheng Dong, a doctor in the Zhuoxi province of Shangsha province, also acted as the Prime Minister's deputy and handled less important matters. This errand is actually not that important, because major matters among the six ministries are usually directly reported to the Emperor by the ministers and ministers of each ministry, and the same is true for other departments. Even if there is a mistake, the major event will not be delayed. Most of these stories are about officials' merit examinations, appointments, transfers, impeachments, etc. What he is holding in his hand at the moment is the case of supervising the censor Zhou Qing's impeachment of Marquis Jingbian for occupying people's fields. The censor has the power to report the matter and does not need to be responsible for what he says. He went down to check the authenticity and discarded some of them. Zheng Dong glanced at the contents of the book and threw it aside. Regardless of whether this matter is true or not, Marquis Jingbian is loyal to King Kong, so he naturally cannot push it out. Instead, he needs to be reminded that he has been targeted by the censor and needs to deal with certain matters from beginning to end. A mansion somewhere in Beijing. Zhou Qing lowered his head to eat. There was still no news about the coupons he handed over 2 days ago. He was worried and a little absent-minded. An old man opposite looked at him and asked, "What, did you encounter some difficulty?" When Zhou Qing heard this, he immediately put down his chopsticks, cupped his hands, and said, "Back to my father-in-law. My son-in-law learned 2 days ago that Marquis Jingbian invaded and occupied people's houses and allowed his subordinates to kill people with sticks, so he immediately submitted the petition for impeachment. Jizi, it's just that when this Jizi entered the Shangshu province, it was like a stone sinking into the sea, and there was no sound anymore." The old man lowered his head and took a sip of the porridge, and said, "Jingbian Marquis is a member of King Kong, and Lang Zhongzhuosi of Shangshu province is also a member of King Kong. How can there be any sound from the fold you handed over?" Zhou Qing was startled and asked, "Are we going to allow Marquis Jingbian to do evil in this way?" The old man looked at him and asked, "Jingbian Ho invaded and occupied people's houses and injured people's lives? Is it true?" Zhou Qing said quickly, "My son-in-law has checked it, and it is absolutely true. The construction of the new house built by the Marquis of Jingbian Mansion has started a few days ago." "I understand." The old man nodded and said, "Tomorrow in the court, I will personally explain this matter to your majesty." Zhou Qing immediately held up his hands and said, "Thank you, father-in-law. Morning court does not happen every day. In total, it is almost once every 3 days. If there is an accident, we will notify you separately." Over the years, officials have long been accustomed to this rule. Today's morning meeting is not much different from the past. The marriage between Princess Pingyang and the Chu state has been almost finalized in recent days. Your Majesty only needs to choose a day to announce it, and there is no need to discuss it separately. On the other hand, the envoys of Chu state have been unable to respond to King Kang's request for marriage to Princess Changning of Chu state. They are afraid that the imperial court will also send envoys to Chu state like them. Today's morning court session lasted only about a quarter of an hour, and no one came to play again. Wei Jian looked down, took 2 steps forward, and asked, "My lords, do you still have something to report? If nothing happens, please retreat. I have my own memorial." An old voice suddenly sounded in the hall. Begwin looked at Shi Yishi Shenzhen, who came out, and secretly guessed that if Shi Yishi could be made to stand up, someone might be in trouble again this time. The old man stepped forward, bowed and said, "I impeach Marquis Jingbian for occupying people's fields, indulging his subordinates, and killing people with sticks." Among the crowd, Zhou Lang Zhendong heard this and his heart immediately lifted. King Kong stood at the front, looking a little embarrassed. But this is not the beginning. As soon as Shi Shenzhen, the imperial censor, finished speaking, another person came out of the queue, holding a whiteboard, and said loudly, "I impeached the Marquis of Yanping, and my son Chen Zhao raped the daughters of the people, and set fire to kill." There was a commotion in the crowd, and more people came out. "I impeach the Marquis of Changxing. I impeach Uncle Yang Chuan. I will impeach Uncle Ning. I impeach Su Cheng, the Minister of the Ministry of Justice, for using power for personal gain and disregarding human life." Everyone seemed to have made an appointment. After the censor stood up, from Marquis Jingbian to the Minister of Punishment, they spoke clearly and logically, and the charges were in order. In less than a quarter of an hour, 10 many powerful officials were impeached. Most of the officials were already stunned on the spot. If a single person was impeached, they would not be so surprised at all, but dozens of people were impeached in a row, and all the charges were serious crimes of murder and arson. For the powerful people in the DPRK, there is still the possibility of private mediation on these matters, but once brought to the court, he is destined to be unable to do good. And these people, more or less, have some connection with King Kong. This was a premeditated impeachment against King Kong. At the front of the crowd, King Kang's face had turned from gloomy to a little pale. It's almost done, right? Tang Ning took a few days off due to her back injury and didn't have to go to the criminal department. She lay on the grass in the yard, put her hands behind her head, and murmured as she looked at the blue sky. Tang Yao Yao jumped down from the wall and asked, "What's almost done?" Tang Ning subconsciously covered his waist. Ever since the last time she straddled him from behind and twisted his waist while struggling, he would feel a dull pain in his lower back every time he saw her. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 325. In the court. Before the court was dismissed, the hall was once again in a stalemate. Led by the imperial censor Shen Zheng, more than a dozen important officials stood up and launched an impeachment against many dignitaries in the capital. On the surface, they impeached the dignitaries for their disregard for the king's law, but secretly pointed the finger at King Kong. The imperial censor who stood up first was also stunned in place, not expecting the current situation at all. He looked back, as if he realized something, and looked at the Minister of Rights Tang Hui not far away, with a strange look in his eyes. When no one stood up to impeach again, the officials had roughly sorted out the cause and effect of the matter. These impeachments can actually be roughly classified into three things. The first thing is that some dignitaries in the capital were indeed too arrogant and lawless after King Kong came to power, bullying the people, committing public anger, and causing the imperial censor and court officials to scramble to impeach. The second thing was that Su Chang, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Justice, protected these people, leaving the people with nowhere to appeal for justice and nowhere to complain. The last thing was that some impeachment memorials were sent to the Ministry of Shangshu, but then fell into oblivion and no news came back. The spearhead of this incident was pointed at some officials in the Ministry of Shangshu. These three things were linked together, and it was a big deal. Even the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Shangshu were infiltrated. This was not only a bullying of the people, but also a disaster for the court. Emperor Chen sat at the top, his expression showing no emotion. He looked at Su Chang, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Justice, and asked, "Is this true?" Su Chang's face turned pale, and he naturally couldn't admit it at this time. He said calmly, "I have never protected or shielded anyone. Your Majesty, please understand." Emperor Chen thought for a while and said, "Since so many people have impeached, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Justice will be suspended for the time being. Song Yi, the minister of the Ministry of Justice, will investigate the Ministry of Justice himself, and the censorate will assist. If anyone disregards the law, bullies the people, or protects or shields anyone, we will never tolerate it." "Yes, I command." The minister of the Ministry of Justice and the censor said in unison. The morning court was over, and all the officials walked out of the hall with different expressions. No one expected that there would be such a big shock at the morning court today. After Prince Duan's decadence, Prince Kong was very successful in the court, and the scene just now was undoubtedly a blow to him. Jingbian Ho, Yanping Ho, and others, who is not his vassal. This time, if the impeachment is implemented, even if it does not involve King Kong, it will be a heavy blow to him. There is no doubt that this is another indirect contest between Prince Duan and King Kong, but Prince Duan, who has always been at a disadvantage, finally made a good move this time. If the impeachment is successful this time, the loss suffered by King Kong is immeasurable, and the court may return to a situation where the power of the two kings is balanced. Censorate. The chief censor looked at the attendant censor Shen Zheng with shock on his face and asked, "Sir Shen, why don't you discuss such a big thing with us?" Just now in the court, led by the attendant censor, everyone attacked King Kang's faction. Shen Zheng played a big role. Those who are not aware of it may think that this is a blow to King Kong by the censorate. The imperial censor came in and said, "I'm afraid those who pushed this matter behind the scenes didn't discuss it with Lord Shen." Shen Zheng bowed to the imperial censor and said, "I'm stupid and have caused trouble for the imperial censorate. It's not a big deal. The imperial censor waved his hand and said, if no one from the imperial censorate stands up, I'm afraid that a crime of negligence will be inevitable in a few days, and His Majesty will be disappointed in the imperial censorate. If you don't stand up, someone else will have to stand up. The chief censor stepped forward and said, but if we do this, won't we offend King Kong? It is the duty of the censorate to monitor the officials and dignitaries and report what others dare not report. How can we say that we have offended them? The censor-in-chief said calmly, it is not terrible to offend King Kong. The most terrible thing is that if His Majesty thinks that the censorate is no different from ordinary officials in the court. He looked at the chief censor and said, don't rush to stand in line. You must know that we are not above Prince Duan or King Kong, but His Majesty. Kong Wang Mansion. Censorate, what does the censorate want to do? King Kong, who had just returned to the mansion, was furious. Neither the councillors nor the servants dared to approach. A man hurried in from outside and said, Your Highness, Marquis Jingbian and Marquis Yanping are waiting at the back door, and they want to see your Highness. No, King Kong waved his hand fiercely and said, they caused the trouble themselves, so they should clean it up by themselves. If they make me suffer, I will not forgive them. A councillor stepped forward and said, Your Highness, I have to see them. Marquis Jingbian and Marquis Yanping are loyal to your Highness. If your Highness ignores them at this time, I am afraid you will lose the support of the people. Moreover, if something happens to them, we will also lose a lot of help. King Kong turned around abruptly, do you mean to let me intervene? The man nodded and said, with your Highness's current status, you only need to move around a little. Although you can't eliminate this matter, you can reduce the impact. Absolutely not. Before he finished his sentence, a middle-aged man stood up. The middle-aged man looked at King Kong and said solemnly, Your Highness, this is definitely not an accident. Someone must be behind this. In my opinion, they must have a trick up their sleeve. If your Highness takes action personally, you will be stuck in the quagmire and will never be able to escape unscathed. Mr. Su is right. King Kong thought carefully, nodded, and said, it took a lot of effort for me to climb to where I am today. I must not put myself in danger. Come, tell Marquis Jingbian and Marquis Yanping, they will solve the problem themselves. Advancing is risky, retreating is unpopular. Unexpectedly, he would find himself in a dilemma. A look of resentment appeared on King Kong's face, and he gritted his teeth and said, the Tang family must be the Tang family. Tang family. Tang Chi breathed a long sigh of relief and murmured, the game has been set up. It depends on whether King Kong returns or enters. I hope he will enter, but according to King Kong's temperament, he will definitely choose to protect himself. Tang Hui picked up the teacup and put it down again, and said, Your Majesty knows whether he is retreating or advancing. What I am worried about is that if we set up a trap for King Kong, we are not slipping into someone else's trap. What is the purpose of the person who set up the trap? What is? Tang Ning is preparing a medicine. According to the old beggar, after taking this medicine, people will enter a state of suspended animation. He has recently learned a lot of weird formulas. If he has the opportunity, he can discuss it with Xiaoju. Today in the court, Marquis Yanping and the other ministers of the Ministry of Punishment were impeached. My father ordered the Ministry of Punishment and the Yashitai to conduct a strict investigation. Zhao Man walked in from the outside and asked, does this matter have anything to do with you? Tang Ning looked back at her and said, it's a small relationship. Although you are smart, there are conspiracies everywhere in the court. As long as you make a mistake in calculation, you may lose everything. Zhao Man looked at him and said, you should be careful in the future and don't make mistakes in everything thinking of taking it to yourself. I understand. Thank you for reminding her. Princess Tang Ning thanked her for her kind words. When she looked at her again, her expression was slightly startled and she asked, what's wrong with Princess's hand? The index finger of her left hand was wrapped with a circle of white gauze, and there were obviously shallow scars on her hand. She didn't have to cook, didn't know how to embroider, and didn't do any rough work, so it looked strange to have a wound on her hand. "It's nothing, I got hurt accidentally." Zhao Man retracted his hand into his sleeve and said, "I'm going back." Tang Ning watched her walk out of the yard, shook her head, and turned back to prepare the medicine. Ministry of Punishment. The Minister of Punishment looked at the files piled up on the desk, rubbed his brows, and looked helpless. The cases seized by Su Cheng are piled up here, but it is not easy to investigate them one by one, because there are too many powerful people involved, and I am afraid that they will encounter unimaginable resistance. Even though he is the Minister of Punishment, he still thinks this is a hot potato. He opened a file, and a clerk knocked on the door and came in, saying, "Sir, Mr. Tang has returned to the office." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 326. Tang Ning rested at home for a few days, and returned to the Ministry of Justice after his back injury healed. Although the 3-month term of the Ministry of Justice was about to end, with less than 10 days left, he still had to stand his last shift. When he walked into the duty room of the Ministry of Justice, he looked up and saw a strange official. Tang Ning looked at the seat where he was sitting, thought for a while, and asked, "This, sir, is it Yang Lang?" The official stood up, bowed and said, "Master Tang, I have heard of you for a long time." Tang Ning remembered that before he came to the Ministry of Justice, Yang Lang seemed to have taken sick leave due to a foot injury, which lasted for 2 months or nearly 3 months. This was the first time he saw him in the Ministry of Justice. He bowed to him and asked, "Is Yang Lang's foot injury better?" Yang Lang smiled and said, "Thank you for your concern, Master Tang. My injury has healed." Tang Ning exchanged a few words with Yang Lang and sat back in his seat. "It's good that Yang Lang is here. He is the head of the Ministry of Justice. He can have some free time in the days ahead." Yang Lang sat at the table, raised his head, and looked in the direction of Tang Ning intentionally or unintentionally. Although he was not in the Ministry of Justice for nearly 3 months, he was always paying attention to the news of the Ministry of Justice. Before Tang Ning came to the Ministry of Justice, there were rumors that this person was the jinx of the special Kessi. He mutilated himself and left the Yamen to avoid disaster. But who would have thought that he did nothing out of the ordinary in the 3 months in the Ministry of Justice? He also presided over the compilation of Zhuanjilu, which recorded the methods of inspection and solving cases in detail. It was praised by His Majesty and promoted throughout the country. His contribution was great. This made Yang Lang almost regret it. If he was also in the Yamen, some of the credit would fall on his shoulders, and his actions were tantamount to pushing it away. The peace and quiet of the past 3 months also made him completely relieved. He bravely returned to the Yamen, perhaps he could get a little credit. Yang Lang sat back in his familiar position, brewed a pot of tea, and just as he picked up the teacup, a clerk came in from outside with a pile of files. He stood at the door and was about to walk to Tang Ning's table. When he saw Yang Lang in the room, he was suddenly stunned. After thinking for a while, he turned around, walked to his table, put the files on the table, and said, "Sir Yang, the minister has ordered the Ministry of Justice to review and verify these files as soon as possible." "Got it, put it down." Yang Lang nodded and casually opened a file. "The case in this file is very simple. In order to build a private house, Jing Bianho occupied the people's land and allowed his subordinates to cause a murder. If the offender was an ordinary person, he only needed to sign his name. Even if the criminal was not beheaded, he would end up with a house confiscated and exiled. But this is Jing Bianho, a powerful official in Beijing, with King Kong as his back. How can he, a small criminal official, afford to provoke him?" His hand holding the file trembled, his eyelids twitched, he put it down, and picked up another one. The case of the son of the Marquis of Yanping setting fire and killing people. The case of the son of the Earl of Yangchuan raping women. The case of the Earl of Weiyang letting his son commit murder. After reading several case files, Yang Lang's body trembled slightly, and cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Any of these cases is enough to give him, a criminal official, a headache. Letting a small official like him handle these cases is like asking him to die. He stood up and looked at a clerk in the yamen, saying, "Is Minister Su here? I want to find him." The clerk said, "My lord, Minister Su has been suspended for covering up a case." Suspended? Yang Lang stood there, muttering, "Why do you say suspended?" He fell back to the chair, picked up the last file, and opened it with trembling. The case of Minister Su Cheng of the Criminal Department covering up. Tang Ning had heard about what happened in the morning court from Xiaoju. Under the secret instructions and support of the Tang family, more than 10 court officials, including a censor, collectively attacked Jingbian Ho, Yanping Ho, and others. His Majesty ordered the Ministry of Justice and the Censorate to thoroughly investigate these cases. Once implemented, these dignitaries will be skinned alive. Although the laws of the Chen Kingdom also have some preferential treatment for the dignitaries, this preferential treatment is limited. If the dignitaries really treat the lives of the people as if they were not human lives, they will also end up miserably. Xiao Anbo is an example. It is one thing for them to do these things secretly. No matter how the officials below cover up and conceal them, once they are brought up in the Golden Palace in front of all the officials, most of them will not be able to be resolved peacefully. Fortunately, Yang Lang came back in time, otherwise, he would have been busy in the last days of the Ministry of Justice. Tang Ning was leisurely drinking tea and writing the latest volume of the latest public case novel. At a certain moment, he looked up and glanced, and saw Yang Lang stood up and walked out in a daze. He started writing again, but before he could write a few words, he heard a cry from a clerk outside the door. "Oh no, oh no, Yang Lang fell into the well. Hurry up and help him." In the Ministry of Justice, an old man looked at Yang Lang lying on the bed, shook his head, and said, "Yang Lang has just recovered from his old injury, and now he has a new injury. This time, he needs at least 2 months to recuperate." Tang Ning sympathized with Yang Lang's misfortune. On the first day of his return to the office, he fell into the abandoned dry well of the Ministry of Justice. The location of the well was very remote, and there were fences around it. The officials of the Ministry of Justice couldn't figure out why Yang Lang fell into the well and was seriously injured, but the moment Yang Lang was rescued, the Shangshu ordered the wellhead of the dry well to be sealed. Xingbu Yamen, Xingbu Shangshu Songyi looked at Tang Ning and said, "Yang Lang is seriously injured and needs to recuperate. These days, the Xingbu Yamen affairs will be left to Mr. Tang." After that, without waiting for Tang Ning to answer, he pointed to the files on Yang Lang's table and said, "His Majesty has specially instructed these cases. There will also be people from the Yashitai to keep an eye on these cases. Chief Tang must handle them as soon as possible." Although Tang Ning didn't want to take the blame or cause trouble, he was not as ruthless as Yang Lang. He would not even let himself go if he was ruthless. The only well in the Xingbu Yamen has been sealed. He can't climb to the roof and jump off again. In addition, over-the-wall rooms have long been a common occurrence for him, and there is no floor in the entire Xingbu where he would be injured if he jumped. Unexpectedly, after going around in circles, killing people with a borrowed knife and saving the country through twists and turns, in the end, I still have to cut off the knife myself. He moved the files to his desk, looked at a clerk, and said, "Go and get all the files that Mr. Su is on duty in." The cover-up case of Su Cheng, the Minister of Criminal Affairs, was the simplest. All the files he had intercepted were piled in the check-in room. All he had to do was to report the truth and Chen Huang would make his own judgment. The case involving Miss Liana's family has both witnesses and physical evidence, so it can be closed immediately. As for other cases, Tang Ning believed that the Tang family had already prepared everything behind the scenes, and no matter who investigated these cases, it wouldn't take much effort. Even so, Tang Ning was still a little dissatisfied with the behavior of the Minister of Punishment, passing the blame to him. It just so happened that in the years I was the Minister of Punishment, the unfilial son of Lord Song Ci and Song, who killed his relatives in the end, did not have a name yet. The name Song Yi is quite suitable. After finishing writing the new chapter in a hurry, Tang Ning picked up a file, looked at a scribe, and said, "Sheng Tang. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 327. Ruyizilang Jun Text Volume 325 Chapter 325 Different. The investigation in the Ministry of Justice was much smoother than Tang Ning had imagined. The case was not complicated, which was partly because the case was not complicated. Another important reason was that both the summoning of witnesses and the collection of evidence were very smooth, with almost no mistakes and no obstacles. It was as if someone had arranged everything and handed it to him every time he needed it. If there were more good people like this in the capital, the efficiency of solving cases in the Ministry of Justice could be improved by several levels. With both human and material evidence, it didn't make much difference whether the criminal pleaded guilty or not. As the head of the Ministry of Justice, Tang Ning only needed to report the investigation results truthfully, and he would have nothing to do. It took Tang Ning only more than 2 days to close all the cases of more than a dozen cases. Although he didn't know how Emperor Chen would deal with those dignitaries, as the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Justice, he didn't redress the grievances of the people, but instead protected the criminals. It was definitely not as simple as a salary deduction. Tang Ning sighed a little. He thought he could spend the last 10 days in the Ministry of Justice in peace, but in the end, he still couldn't get rid of the hat of being a jinx to his superiors. The higher UPS dealt with these people a little faster than he expected. Su Cheng, the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Justice, took advantage of his position to shield the criminal. He was immediately removed from the position of Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Justice and was awaiting investigation. Han Dong, the Left Secretary, was also removed from the position of Left Secretary, although the degree of shielding was less than Su Cheng. Although he was not out of office, he was inevitably demoted. Jing Bianho was stripped of his title and demoted to a commoner, becoming the second dignitary to be directly stripped of his title in the past year. Yanping Ho, Yang Chuanbo and others were not good at educating their children. Even if they were not stripped of their titles, they were fined a large sum of money to compensate the victims. In addition, the sons of Yanping Ho and others were also sentenced to exile and could not enter Beijing in this life. The rich and powerful are still rich and powerful. Unless they are plotting treason or committing some serious crime beyond the tolerance limit of the court, they will not lose their lives. But for these dandies who have been living a life of luxury since childhood, abandoning their comfortable lives and being exiled is, to some extent, more painful than death. The losses and influences suffered by many rich and powerful people involved in the case are far greater than what can be seen on the surface. The families that were originally expected to continue their glory may decline rapidly in the next few years after this incident. Prince Kang's mansion. Your Majesty punished the rich and powerful in the capital, and Prince Kang was not directly affected, but at this moment, Prince Kang's mansion was full of gloom. All these officials and dignitaries have close ties with King Kong. So far, they have lost a Zhou Si Lang Zhong and a Xingbu Shilang who just defected, not to mention the dignitaries who have been weakened. This is just the visible and tangible. King Kang's reputation in the court and the hearts of the dignitaries have suffered a huge blow after this incident. The advantages established in the struggle with Prince Duan over the past year were lost in one day. In the meeting room, King Kong has been silent for half an hour since he received the news from the palace. The people around him also said nothing, for fear of disturbing King Kong, who fell from the peak to the bottom of the valley overnight, and being innocently angered. Your Highness, the court is like a battlefield, victory and defeat are common, and you must not be discouraged. The first person to break the silence was a middle-aged man. Someone said, yes, Your Highness, we still have some advantages over Prince Duan. Your Highness must not be depressed. Prince Kong clenched his fist with one hand, slammed it heavily on the table, and gritted his teeth and said, I am not willing to accept this. The fist slammed on the table, making a dull sound, and everyone's hearts tightened. Not only was Prince Kong unwilling, but even they were unwilling. It was not easy to leave Prince Duan far behind on the road to succession, and they were only half a step away from the position of the East Palace. How could they be willing to watch their side retreat to the same position as Prince Duan? Since then, Prince Kang's reputation in the court has greatly declined, and he has also lost the hearts of many powerful people. Although His Majesty did not directly target Prince Kong, each of these severe punishments was almost cutting his wings. Someone thought for a moment and said, Your Majesty asked the Ministry of Justice to take charge of this case, but Lord Tang showed no mercy at all and did not send anyone to inform Your Highness. The middle-aged man surnamed Su shook his head and said, This case was ordered by His Majesty himself and supervised by the Censoriate. Lord Tang can only handle it impartially. If he even shields him, not only will he be in danger, but Your Highness may also be implicated. Lord Tang did the right thing in this matter. The man argued, even if he can't shield him, can't his men show some mercy? It's still unknown whether this person is of the same mind as us. Although King Kong didn't speak, his brows slightly frowned. The middle-aged man surnamed Su looked at King Kong, sighed in his heart, but didn't say anything else. In the palace, Emperor Chen put down the memorial of the Ministry of Justice, walked into the hall with his hands behind his back, and said, One Vice Minister of the Ministry of Revenue, one Vice Minister of the Ministry of Justice, I and the court officials are busy governing the world, but these two are busy eating away the court. Wei Jian, tell me, if these two become emperors, will the people still have a good life? After Emperor Chen finished speaking for a long time, there was no response from the hall. He turned his head and saw Wei Jian dozing against the pillar, and coughed lightly. Wei Jian immediately opened his eyes and said, First the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Revenue, now the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Justice, in my opinion, Lord Tang, the hat of the unlucky boss, I am afraid it will not be taken off. Unlucky star, Emperor Chen looked out the window and said, Everyone says he is an unlucky star who defeats his superiors, but who has ever thought that what he does is all within his job, and he defeats corrupt officials? If there are unlucky stars like him in this court, how much effort can I save? Wei Jian bowed slightly and said, Lord Tang is indeed different. I originally thought that he and Fang Zhe were the same kind of people, but now I understand that he is different from anyone else. Emperor Chen sat down at the table again and said, I hope he can always be different like this. Lord, you are so kind, I am grateful to you. I can't repay you in this life, but I am willing to work like a cow and a horse in the next life to repay your kindness. In the inn, a mother and daughter knelt down on their knees facing Tang Ning and spoke in a trembling voice. Tang Ning hurriedly helped Miss Lianer and her daughter up and said, You don't have to do this. This is my job. The old woman next to Miss Lianer said firmly, No, if it weren't for you, those evil people would still be at large. We mother and daughter will remember your kindness for the rest of our lives. Tang Ning was still not very good at dealing with such a situation. He comforted them a few words and walked out of the inn. Classes have existed since ancient times and will never disappear. The powerful are the powerful, and they have privileges that ordinary people don't have, especially in this era. If it weren't for the Tang family behind the scenes, expanding the situation, and detonating it in the court, these victims would probably not get justice. And the original intention of the Tang family was not to help these people get justice. They just used this as a tool to attack King Kong. The internship at the Ministry of Justice is about to end. Tang Ning doesn't know where his next job will be, but after the Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Justice, he is likely to be blacklisted by other ministries. It depends on the emperor's mood which ministry he will harm next time. When he left home, he saw Zhao Man sitting in the pavilion in the courtyard. Tang Ning hadn't seen her much in the past 2 days, and didn't know what she was busy with in the mansion. When he walked to the pavilion, Zhao Man looked over at him and said, "Brother Kong is narrow-minded. Although you are acting on orders, you have also personally interrogated those dignitaries. I am worried that he will hate you." Tang Ning didn't care about this, but still nodded and said, "Thank you for the reminder, Princess. I understand. Be careful in the future." Zhao Man stood up, took out something from her arms, handed it to him, and said, "This is for you, HTT. Fortunate young gentleman." Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 328. Tang Ning looked at the item in his hand and murmured, "This. Just consider it a parting gift." Zhao Man looked up at him, his eyes lingering for a while before he said, "I'm moving back to the palace today." Tang Ning was surprised and said, "So soon?" "My father has agreed to Chu's marriage proposal." Zhao Man looked at him and said, "I will leave for Chu in a month, and we won't meet again." Tang Ning looked at her, his lips parted, and for a moment he didn't know what to say. "It's nice to meet you." Zhao Man suddenly smiled and said, "These half a month or so have been the happiest days of my life." "Thank you. Say goodbye to Sister Zhong and Sister Su for me." She waved her hand, turned around and took 2 steps, then stopped again. She stayed where she was for a moment before slowly turning around and looking up at Tang Ning. Her eyes stayed on Tang Ning's face, and she said, "I have something to say to you." Tang Ning nodded and said, "Princess, please speak." "I." Zhao Man moved her lips, and finally shook her head, saying, "If there is a chance to meet again, I will tell you." After that, she turned and walked out, never looking back. Zhao Man lived in the princess's mansion for less than a month, and then moved back to the palace. This was because the marriage between Chen and Chu had been officially finalized. Before that, the royal family had to make many etiquette preparations. During this period, she could only stay in the palace and could not see outsiders. Tang Ning sat on the wall, looking at the empty princess's mansion, put her parting gift in her arms, and jumped back to the yard from the wall. He walked to the pavilion and sat down, looking forward, a little absent-minded. "Brother Xiaoning." Su Ru walked in from outside, handed him the steaming bowl, and said, "You didn't eat much just now, drink some porridge." A lot of things happened today. Tang Ning didn't have much appetite, but he still took the bowl and drank it in small sips. Su Ru looked at the yard next door and asked, "Has the princess moved away?" Zhao Man has lived next door for less than a month, and she has become familiar with Xiao Ru and Xiao Yi as sisters. Tang Ning put down the bowl and said, "The court is about to prepare for a marriage, and she can't live outside anymore." Su Ru took out a handkerchief, wiped his mouth, and said, "Her Royal Highness is kind-hearted. I don't know what kind of person the Crown Prince of Chu is. I hope she will be happy after marrying into Chu." Xiao Ru didn't know what kind of person the Crown Prince of Chu was, but Tang Ning knew it clearly. He was a scum who was even more disgusting than King Kong and King Duan. Zhao Man went to Chu this time and jumped into a fire pit. After drinking a bowl of porridge, he walked out of the house and walked around. Before he knew it, he came to Tianrunju. "Why, you're unhappy?" Su Mei was swinging in the yard. Seeing him coming in, she asked, "Hasn't the matter of the Ministry of Justice been resolved? If King Kong has a little bit of brains, he won't hate you for it. What else is bothering you?" "Nothing." Tang Ning waved his hand and said, "I'm bored, so I'll play a few rounds." Su Mei took out the white jade mahjong, searched in the box, and said, "The dice is gone." I'm too lazy to find it. You draw the cards first. In order to show fairness, they usually use the odd and even points of the dice to decide who draws the cards first. Tang Ning took out a dice from his arms and said, "No, I have it." He threw the dice on the table, looked at it, and said, "6, an even number, you draw first." Su Mei stretched out her hand, but she didn't draw the cards, but picked up the dice. She looked at the dice carefully, then looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Where did this dice come from?" "Someone gave it to me." Tang Ning looked at the dice in Su Mei's hand. He didn't know why Zhao Man gave him this, and didn't know if it was to wish him to get rich soon. Su Mei showed an interested expression on her face and asked, "Who gave it to me?" Tang Ning looked at her and realized that something was wrong, so he asked, "What's wrong?" Su Mei blinked and asked, "It was given to me by a woman, right?" Tang Ning was surprised and asked, "How do you know?" Su Mei looked at the small and exquisite dice in her hand, looked at him and asked, "Do you know what this is?" "Dice. Of course I know it's a dice." Su Mei rolled her eyes at him, handed the dice to him, and said, "Take a closer look. What's different about this dice?" "It's just a dice." Tang Ning looked at it carefully and asked in surprise, "What is the red thing inside the dice?" "Red beans." Su Mei looked at him and explained, "Wang Wei has a poem that says, red beans grow in the south, and a few branches sprout in spring. I hope you can pick more of them, as they are the most acacia-inspiring, so red beans are also called acacia beans. Red beans in the dice represent deep acacia, so tell me honestly, which woman gave you this token of love?" "Red beans in the exquisite dice, do you know how deep acacia you are?" Tang Ning was stunned and immediately recalled a poem by Wen Tingyun in his mind. Since ancient times, red bean dice have been a token of love between women and men. After Su Mei reminded him, he immediately remembered it, but the dice in his hand fell on the table, and he was puzzled. How is this possible? When walking back from Tianrunju, Tang Ning still had some doubts in his heart. He walked to the door of Tang Mansion, and a figure came over and said, "Master Tang, my master wants to see you." Tang Ning looked at the girl. "Your master?" The girl pointed to the carriage not far away and said, "My master is right there." This was in front of the Tang Mansion. Tang Ning was not worried about assassins or anything. She walked to the carriage and saw a figure getting off the carriage. Tang Ning looked at the figure and said in surprise, "Princess Anyang." Princess Anyang looked at him, smiled, and said, "Master Tang, could you please take a step to talk?" Red Sleeve Pavilion. After Tang Ning sat down, she raised her head and asked, "I wonder if the princess is looking for me, but what's the important matter?" Princess Anyang looked at him and said, "I am here for Princess Pingyang." "Princess, what's wrong with Princess?" "The princess likes you, do you know?" Cough, cough, Tang Ning choked on a mouthful of tea, covered her mouth and coughed violently. Princess Anyang looked at him and asked, "Are you okay?" Tang Ning coughed for a while, patted her chest, and said, "Sorry, I lost my temper in front of the princess." Princess Anyang shook her head and said she didn't care. She looked at Tang Ning and continued, "Actually, like Mr. Tang, I didn't believe it at first. Pingyang has been simple-minded, playful, and willful since he was a child. How do you know what love is?" Tang Ning wiped the corner of her mouth, shook her head and said, "The princess is still a child. She has not experienced anything, so she may mistake certain feelings for love." "I thought so at the beginning." Princess Anyang looked at him and said, "But children will always grow up. I don't know when she started to like you, but I know that she would rather marry herself. When I go to Chu State and marry someone I don't like, I don't want to hurt you, and I don't even want to tell you this. She regards you as more important than herself." "What kind of feelings does Mr. Tang think?" Tang Ning took a sip of tea and didn't answer. Princess Anyang stood up and said, I am telling you this today not because I want you to do something for her, but I just think you should know these things. Tang Ning felt that the amount of information he received today was more than an entire box of books in the Hanlin Academy. Zhao Yingying likes him. Are you kidding? How could she like him? Little girl movie. He sat in the yard, looking at the exquisite dice in his hand, dumbfounded. A figure walked in from outside the courtyard, looked at him, and said, "Master Tang, your Majesty has summoned you." It was really hard to have a moment's leisure today. Not long after Tang Ning returned home, she got on the carriage entering the palace again. The place where Emperor Chen summoned him was in the imperial study room. In addition to him, the ministers of the Ministry of Punishment and the Ministry of Hubu were also there. Tang Hui, the Minister of Rights, was also on the list. No need to guess, the other three should be the ministers of the other three departments. When Tang Ning walked in, Emperor Chen was reprimanding Song Yi, the Minister of Punishment. As the Minister of the Ministry of Justice, my subordinates are so blatantly protecting me. Can't you see? The Ministry of Justice is a place to redress the grievances of the people, not a place where the people are wronged. Chen Huang scolded him before his tone gradually softened. He said, "For the position of Minister of Justice, a replacement will be elected as soon as possible." Song Yi, Shangshu of the Ministry of Punishment, said quickly, "I obey the order." Emperor Chen nodded, looked at Tang Hui, and said, "The Ministry of Etiquette must start preparations for the princess's wedding as soon as possible. It is related to the face of our country, Chen. There can be no mistakes in all etiquette. The preparations must be completed within a month. In addition, the candidate for the wedding messenger should also be selected from your etiquette department." Tang Hui cupped his fists and bowed, saying, "I obey your order." Chen Huang discussed a few more matters with the 6 ministers before looking at Tang Ning, who had been waiting for a long time, and asked, "Among the 6 ministers, you have already completed the household and criminal departments. Where do you want to go in the next one?" As soon as Chen Huang said this, all the 6 ministers, except the Minister of Hubu and the Minister of Punishment, had strange expressions on their faces. Tang Ning's eyes swept over several people one by one, and finally stopped on one person. "Master Tang, I'm afraid that I'm going to cause trouble to the Ministry of Rights next time." He cupped his hands towards Tang Hui, holding an exquisite dice in his palm. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 329. Ministry of Etiquette. Chen Huang looked at Tang Ning with surprise on his face. Because what he just said was Master Tang and not Master Zhou, Chen Huang was sure that he wanted to go to the Ministry of Rights rather than the Ministry of Officials. He knew clearly in his heart the grudge between Tang Ning and the Tang family. It was an irreversible feud between life and death. Therefore, before deciding to let Tang Ning walk in the 6th department, he had even thought that when it was the turn of the etiquette department, he might resist. When the time came, it would be okay to skip the etiquette department. However, he never thought that he would actually take the initiative. Requirements for entry into the Ministry of Rights. After just a moment of surprise, his face returned to calmness again, and he nodded, "In that case, Tang Shangshu, please arrange him in your Ministry of Etiquette." Tang Hui had a calm expression on his face and said calmly, "I obey your order." The other ministers looked at Tang Ning and then at Tang Hui, feeling suspicious and surprised. It was not until everyone exited the hall that the Minister of the Ministry of Justice, who was lagging behind slightly, looked at the Minister of the Ministry of Personnel and was confused. He actually chose the Ministry of Rights. "I thought I heard it wrong just now." The Minister of the Ministry of Personnel breathed a sigh of relief and said, "I almost heard that he was the Ministry of Personnel. We, the Ministry of Personnel, cannot withstand such torture from him." Song Yi, the Minister of Punishment, felt the same and sighed, "Now that he is gone, I can finally take a breath." I don't know how Tang Hui feels now. His close nephew has become a formidable enemy. The Tang family was really gone back then. It's a bad move. However, the Ministry of Rights is the Qinghui Yamen. Even if he goes, it will be difficult to stir up trouble. How can Tang Hui's handle be so easy to grasp? The minister of Libya shook his head and said, I think nothing happens without a reason in this world. Since he chose the Ministry of Rights, he must have a plan. Song Yi thought for a while and said in surprise, what else can he want? The Minister of Civil Affairs waved his hand and said, I don't know, but I believe that he must have some purpose. Let's wait and see what happens. Ministry of Rights. Not long after Tang Hui returned to the Ministry of Rights, in the study room, the Minister of the Ministry of Rights and the 4 ministers all had a look of surprise on their faces. Master Shangshu, did that person really choose our Ministry of Rights next? If anything goes wrong, there will be a monster, so we must be on guard against it. He must have some purpose in coming to our etiquette department. Everyone should be extra careful. Lu Feng, the minister of the Ministry of Rights, looked at the 4 ministers, frowned and said, why are you panic? The Ministry of Rights is not the Ministry of Husbandry, nor the Ministry of Punishments. If he comes to our Ministry of Rights, what kind of trouble can he cause? After the 4 doctors thought about it carefully, they calmed down. The Ministry of Rights does not control the country's money and food, nor does it care about the appointment and dismissal of officials. It does not try cases, does not build, and does not lead troops. The Ministry of Rights is in charge of etiquette, sacrifices, and tribute. It is a complete Qingshui Yamen, and even the censor is not willing to come. What's more, the entire Ministry of Rights is a mess. What kind of trouble can an outsider cause here? Lu Feng looked at everyone, looked at Tang Hui again, and asked, although our etiquette department is not afraid of an outsider, we can't let him mess around. Now that the princess is about to get married, the host and guests are responsible for hosting it. There can't be any mistakes. The catering department can easily someone is tampering with him, the rights department is very important, and the temple department is free, so why not let him go to the temple department? Tang Hui raised no objection to this, looked at the host and guest, and said, Your Majesty intends to select a wedding messenger from the Ministry of Etiquette. Since the princess's wedding is hosted by your host and guest, you will be the wedding messenger this time. Take charge. The host and guest, both men and women, bowed their hands and said, Your Majesty, I obey. Ministry of Etiquette. Somewhere in the palace, Xiaoju looked at Tang Ning and said in surprise, You are crazy. The Ministry of Rights is the Ministry of Rights of the Tang family. Tang Hui has been the Minister of Rights for many years and has already firmly controlled the Ministry of Rights. The entire Ministry of Rights is a piece of iron. You go, what does the Ministry of Rights do? Tang Ning looked at somewhere in the palace and said, I have a reason why I have to go. You don't really think you are the broom star, do you? Xiaoju looked at him and said, the Minister of Hubu and the Minister of Punishment brought their own fault. The Ministry of Rights has no money and no power, so it's useless for you to go there. What's more, if Tang Hui wanted to do anything to you in the Ministry of Rights, it would be easy, in my opinion. You can just go to the other 5 departments. It's better not to go to the Ministry of Rights. Tang Ning patted his shoulder and said, Don't worry, I know what's going on. Although he is not a broom star, if he wants to be a broom star, a minister of the Ministry of Rights cannot stop him. Tang Ning waved her hand and said, You can continue your work, I'm going back. He walked to a certain palace wall and stopped. On the other side of this wall is the harem, where the emperor's concubines and princesses who have not left the palace live. Outsiders are not allowed to enter without permission. He raised his head and looked at the sky on the other side of the palace wall, his eyes moving slightly. Separated by a wall, the girl stopped, raised her head, looked at the sky outside the wall, and sighed softly. There were only a few days left before the March term of the Ministry of Punishments, so Tang Ning left the Ministry of Punishments and took up his post at the Ministry of Rights the next day. The Minister of Justice happily expressed his strong dissatisfaction with him, and then helped him complete all the procedures as quickly as possible. On the first day when Tang Ning came to the Ministry of Rights, she did not see Tang Hui but met Lu Feng, the Minister of the Ministry of Rights. Among the 6 ministries, the Ministry of Husbandry, the Ministry of Personnel, and the Ministry of War all have 2 ministers. According to the arrangement of Master Shangshu, Chief Tang will serve in the ancestral hall, Lu Feng said, then looked at the person behind him and said, Mr. Lu, take Chief Tang to the ancestral hall. The attitude of the Ministry of Rights towards him was far inferior to that of the Ministry of Husbandry and even the Ministry of Punishment. However, Tang Ning didn't care. He came to the Ministry of Rights to engage in, and study, and he would not be disturbed by these external factors. Like other departments, there are 4 subordinate departments under the Ministry of Rights. The first is the Rights Department, the second is the Temple Department, the third is the Food Department, and the fourth is the Host and Guest. The Department of Rights is the main department of the Ministry of Rights, and is mainly responsible for rituals, music, tribute, etc. The Department of Food is responsible for the wine and meals at various ceremonies. The Department of Hosts and Guests is mainly responsible for entertaining foreign guests. This time, they are entertaining the Chu state envoy. He is also responsible for all matters related to the princess's wedding. The Ancestral Department where Tang Ning works is in charge of ancestral worship, sacrifices, astronomy, temple taboos, monks and nuns, etc. There is not much work to do on weekdays, and it is a department that cannot be idle anymore. In fact, he originally thought of the Host and Guest Department or the Department of Rights, but judging from this arrangement, everyone in the Ministry of Rights should be on guard against him and arranged the most leisurely yamen for him. If he stayed here safely, maybe there was no work for months. The doctor at the temple, whose surname was Lu, arranged a place for him in the duty room and then ignored him. The minor officials from the temple who came in and out also stayed far away from his position, as if they were avoiding the god of plague. Tang Ning sat here for several hours, but no one spoke to him. It seemed that he had been selectively ignored. He sat quietly in his seat, boringly drawing circles on the paper with a brush. Suddenly, a man walked in, looked at Lu Langzhong, and said, Lu Langzhong, I remember that there are several pairs of Chen in your ancestral hall. If you are familiar with the classics, please lend it to me for now. Lu Langzhong looked at him and said in surprise, why are you borrowing these people? Find a few more people to be prepared. This marriage is about the face of my country, Chen. If something goes wrong, I will not be stabbed in the back. He glanced at Lu Langzhong and said, hurry up. Let them come here, the host and guest are in a hurry. After the man finished speaking, he turned his head and was startled when he saw a figure behind him. Tang Ning looked at the doctor of the temple and asked, Mr. Lu, who is this, sir? Although Langzhong Lu didn't want to take the initiative to talk to Tang Ning, he spoke and he couldn't ignore it. He stood up and said with a smile, this is the host and guest, Langzhong Wang, and he is also the wedding messenger for the princess's wedding. The wedding messenger. Tang Ning looked at Wang Langzhong, cupped her hands, and said with a smile, nice to meet you, nice to meet you. The host and guest had guessed the identity of the stranger at this time, and he casually held his hand in his hand. When he looked up and saw the smile on his face, he couldn't help but shudder, and a chill came from the bottom of his heart. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 330. The Ministry of Rights has a new director, and everyone knows about it in less than half a day. His affairs in the Ministry of Husbandry and the Ministry of Punishments had long made him famous, but what the officials of the Ministry of Rights did not expect was that after leaving the Ministry of Punishments, he actually chose the Ministry of Rights. The reason why the officials of the Ministry of Rights were so familiar with him was not only because his reputation as a broom star was already known throughout the capital, but also because there were dozens of versions of the grievances between the head of the Tang dynasty and the Tang family where Tang Shangshu of the Ministry of Rights belonged to. The Ministry of Rights is nothing to others, but to him, it is a dragon's pond and a tiger's den. I don't know if his actions this time are considered as throwing himself into a trap or letting a sheep fall into the tiger's mouth. In short, before he officially joined the post, the officials of the various yamen of the Ministry of Rights had already received instructions, and the officials of each yamen could just turn a blind eye to him. Especially it was the Ancestral Temple Department that received a key warning. The temple is on duty. Drawing circles all the time on paper would get annoying. Tang Ning put down her pen, stood up again, walked up to the doctor of the temple, and asked, "Mr. Lu, I wonder what I need to do while I'm here." Lu Langzhong looked at him and said with a smile, "My ancestral department does not have any official duties on weekdays. If Mr. Tang feels bored, he can read the official documents of the Ancestral Department and familiarize himself with the official duties first. The affairs of the Ancestral Department are very complicated, including offering sacrifices, astronomical engravings, national and temple taboos, divination and medicine, Taoist and Buddhist matters. These are all within the scope of the Ancestral Department's authority. But there haven't been any big sacrificial activities recently, and other small things have been arranged by the officials. All Tang Ning can do is wait for the official documents while waiting for the office." Host and Guest. The Host and Guest Department is a very special department in the Ministry of Rights. It is only responsible for receiving envoys from other countries and taking charge of diplomatic matters with other countries. However, many times, no envoys from other countries come to Beijing in a year, and the Host and Guest Department becomes an idle yamen. However, from today on, the most idle yamen in the Ministry of Rights has become the busiest yamen in the Ministry of Rights. All the etiquette of the princess's wedding must be arranged one by the host and guest, and verified many times to ensure that no mistakes can be made. The host and guest doctor are even appointed as the wedding envoys, with heavy responsibilities. This time they accompanied the princess on an envoy to Chu state. If everything goes well, you will definitely be promoted within a few years after you come back. In the host and guest department, in a government office, officials are consulting classics and formulating etiquette regulations. During the interval, one of the hosts and guests rubbed his sore eyes and asked in a low voice, "What do you think that person wants to do when he chooses our etiquette department this time?" Another person said, "He must be trying to cause trouble for Tang Shangshu, but he is destined to be disappointed this time. He thought this was the Ministry of Punishment and the Ministry of Household Affairs, and he could do whatever he wanted. He didn't know what Tang Shangshu would do to him. He and the Tang family have a big feud." Ahem, the host and guest, Wei Lang, coughed heavily, glanced at everyone, and said coldly, "Are you able to discuss Tang Shangshu's affairs?" After being reprimanded by the superior officer, several people immediately shut up. One person looked around and immediately changed the subject. "This time Mr. Wang is designated as the wedding messenger, he will definitely have a bright future. Once Mr. Wang is promoted, Mr. Zhang will be promoted soon." A smile appeared on the face of the host and guest, the foreign minister. Wang Langzhong was appreciated by the minister. If he had successfully arranged the wedding arrangements, he would definitely be promoted when he came back. When the time comes, the host and guest would be without the doctor, and he would be the one who has the best chance of succeeding him. The host and guest are all foreigners. He looked at everyone and said, "Work hard. If we can handle this matter well, you will benefit from it." After leaving this room, he went straight to the room of the host and guest. As the wedding messenger, the host and guest doctor were busier than everyone else. The classic books on the table were piled very high. When he saw Zhang Yuan Weilang coming in, he hurriedly said, "Master Zhang, please help me find those princesses who were married in previous years. I remember that the Chu State's files were also handled by our host and guest department at that time." Zhang Yuan Weilang was about to speak when he suddenly covered his nose and frowned. "What does it smell like?" He followed the direction of the smell and finally fixed his gaze on Wang Langzhong. "Gililu." After a strange noise, Wang Langzhong lowered his head and looked down at his body. He smelled a foul smell in his nose. After being stunned for a moment, his expression changed drastically. The yamen of the Ministry of Etiquette is not big to begin with, but the matter of the host and the guest having his pants down spread like wildfire after only half an hour. Although people have 3 urgent needs, as an adult, it is still extremely embarrassing for this kind of thing to happen to you. Wang Langzhong had finished taking a bath and changed his clothes. When he returned to the guest room, his face was red. The officials in the host and guest department naturally did not dare to show any other expressions on their faces. If they offended the leader, they would not be able to reap the benefits from them in the future. They did not even dare to look at him and just immersed themselves in reading the classics. Zhang Yuan Weilang held a pile of files in his arms, knocked on the door, walked into the room, and said, "Sir Wang, I have found all the files you asked for." Put. As soon as Wang Langzhong said something, there was another gilo sound in his stomach. His expression changed and he immediately ran out of the duty room and ran towards the latrine. An hour later, Wang Langzhong, who had gone to the latrine 5 times in a row, already needed help from the servants to walk. "Is the prince sick?" In the study room, Tang Hui put down his pen and asked a small official from the Ministry of Etiquette. The clerk nodded and said, "Back to Master Shangshu, Wang Langzhong is very weak now and needs help from others to walk." The health of the host and guest could have problems at any time, but not now. It would delay the marriage between the 2 countries. Not only him, but also the Ministry of Rights could not bear this responsibility. He looked at Lu Feng, the Minister of Rights, and said, "I will write a note and you will send someone to deliver it to the palace, asking your majesty to send an imperial doctor to look at the matter." Lu Feng cupped his hands and said, "I'll go right away." After sitting around in the Ministry of Rights for a day, the gong for releasing the yamen sounded, and Tang Ning left the yamen alone. When he left, no one from the Ministry of Rights had moved. Although the time for leaving the yamen was fixed, the specific requirements of each ministry were different, and it also depended on the wishes of the minister. However, as a temporary worker, he does not have this restriction. Walking on the street, I saw a carriage approaching from a distance. Because I had helped the Taiyuan hospital compile medical books before, and the carriages that came and went were all Taiyuan hospital's carriages, so I was very familiar with this. He waved his hand and the carriage stopped. The people in the carriage opened the curtain. When they saw Tang Ning, they were startled for a moment, and then said respectfully, "Ling Yuheng has met Uncle Master." Ministry of Rights. Lu Feng looked at Ling Yuheng and asked carefully, "Mr. Ling, what disease is Wang Langzhong suffering from? Is it serious?" "Wang Langzhong is suffering from a gastrointestinal disease." Ling Yuheng stroked the beard on his chin and said, "Although it is not a serious illness, if he is left alone, his life will be in danger." Lu Feng cupped his hands and said hurriedly, "Then please leave it to Dr. Ling." Ling Yuheng wrote down a prescription and said, "Although gastrointestinal diseases are not serious diseases, they are extremely difficult to treat. Mr. Wang needs to take this medicine for a month to recover." Lu Feng was stunned and asked, "1 month?" Ling Yuheng nodded and said, "In the past month, he needs to stay in bed to rest, drink more salt water, and remember not to be too tired, otherwise his life will be in danger." Lu Feng looked at Wang Langzhong who was lying in bed, then cupped his hands to Ling Yuheng and said, "Thank you for your hard work, Dr. Ling." After a while, Lu Feng looked at Tang Huai in the study room and said, 1 month is too long. The marriage is urgent. After 1 month, the princess will set off, and we can't afford to delay it for a day. Tang Huai thought for a while and said, in this case, let's choose another person to send the envoy this time. Lu Feng looked at him and asked, but what should we explain to your majesty? Just tell the truth. Tang Huai stood up and asked, do you think, besides Wang Langzhong, who else is qualified for this job? Lu Feng thought for a while and said, Chen Zheng, the doctor in the Ministry of Rites, is also familiar with the etiquette system. Not long after, in the minister's study room, Chen Zheng, a doctor in the Ministry of Rites, bowed his hands to Tang Huai and said, don't worry, sir. I will live up to your trust. After a while, Chen Zheng walked out of the study room. The cold wind blowing from nowhere made him shiver and he couldn't help but wrap up his clothes tightly. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 331. You said he was fine, how could he suddenly get sick? What a pity. If Dr. Wang hadn't been sick, he would have done a great job as the wedding escort this time. Sickness comes like a mountain, who can predict such a thing? It can only be said that Dr. Wang has bad luck. When he was in the Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Justice, Tang Ning always brought his own food, but he would still eat in the designated dining hall. He occupied a table by himself. There was not enough space in the dining hall, and the officials of the Ministry of Rites would not share a table with him even if they squatted on the ground. Listening to the whispers of the crowd, Tang Ning ate and wiped his mouth and walked out of the dining hall. The reason for Dr. Wang's diarrhea was naturally poisoning. The amount used was much heavier than Xiaoju's medicine. He might have diarrhea for 3 days, and some parts of the body would be more painful, but it was not fatal. After 3 days, the effect of the medicine will disappear. Pay attention to replenishing energy and salt water. He can recover his vitality by lying in bed for 2 days. But if he chooses to take the medicine prescribed by Ling Yuheng, he will probably be weak enough to stop taking the medicine. The Ministry of Rites also acted very quickly. When Tang Ning went to the Yamen the next day, the new marriage envoy had already been designated. It was Chen Zheng, a doctor in the Ministry of Rites. Although the doctors in the 4 departments of the Ministry of Rites had the same rank, the doctor in the Ministry of Rites was the leader in terms of actual status and power. The doctor in the Department of Hosts and Guests could not serve as the marriage envoy because of diarrhea, so the doctor in the Ministry of Rites could not use the same method, otherwise, even a fool would suspect that someone had done something wrong. On the 2nd day in the Ministry of Rites, no one said a word to him. Fortunately, he was least afraid of loneliness. When he was bored, he could review it again and watch a few episodes before he could go home. He could not watch Zhao Yingying jump into the fire pit, nor could he implicate himself or destroy the diplomatic relations between the 2 countries. This matter was difficult to think about and even more difficult to do, but no matter what means he took, he had to strive for the position of marriage envoy. Only in this way could future actions be carried out. The doctor of the Ministry of Guests and Guests will not be able to get out of bed for this month. He also got the handle of Chen Zheng, the doctor of the Ministry of Rites, by sleeping with him 3 times. In addition to Chen Zheng, there are 2 doctors left in the Ministry of Rites, 1 assistant minister and 1 minister. Officials below the 6th rank are not qualified to be marriage envoys. As the minister of the Ministry of Rites, Tang Huai could not be sent to the state of Chu as a marriage envoy, so he only had 3 competitors left: Lu Feng, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rites, the doctor of the Ministry of Food, and the doctor of the Ministry of Shrines. There is still a long way to go. When he was sitting in the room thinking about things, Zhongyi and Su Ryu walked in from outside and sat down beside him. Zhongyi looked at him and asked, "My husband has been absent-minded these past 2 days. Is there something on his mind?" Tang Ning looked at them and asked, if a good friend is about to jump into the fire pit, as a friend, wouldn't it be bad to stand by and watch? Zhongyi looked at him and said, if it's a friend, of course I have to save her. Tang Ning asked again, what if there is a big risk in saving her? Su Aryu looked at him and said, brother Xiao Ning is so smart. If there is really a risk that cannot be avoided, he will not be impulsive. Zhongyi held his hand and asked, my husband, what happened? There was no need to hide this matter from them. Tang Ning told them about the Prince of Chu. The princess is our friend, we don't want her to jump into the fire pit. Zhongyi looked at him and asked, but, how sure are you, sir, to save the princess from the fire pit? Everything depends on human effort. Tang Ning looked at them, thought for a while, and said, I dare not say it is 100%, but it is still 80% to 90%. However, if you decide, you have to go to Chu. Although Zhongyi's eyes were a little reluctant, he still said, it is related to the princess's lifelong happiness, even if it takes a trip to Chu, it is worth it. So, you agree? The princess is also our friend. Zhongyi and Su Aryu looked at each other and said, besides, she called us sisters so many times. Knowing that Sir has a way, he still watched her jump into the fire pit. It's too shameful for her. The whole family is so understanding, being dignified and kind-hearted. Tang Ning's heart was suddenly filled with pride. Zhongyi seemed to remember something, and suddenly looked at Tang Ning and said, the princess seems to be more than just a friend to her husband. Xiao Aryu, what do you think? Su Aryu nodded and said, I think the princess likes her husband a little bit, and the way she looks at her husband is different from others. Nonsense, Tang Ning glared at them and said, how could the princess like me? She is only 17 years old. A 17-year-old girl doesn't know what love is. She is just a little girl. Su Aryu looked down at him and said, brother Xiaoning, I am also 17 years old. Zhongyi pulled his sleeve and said, when I married my husband, I was only 16. Tang Ning looked around, and at a certain moment, she suddenly felt that he was a beast. Especially when he stood up and closed the door, he was more like a beast among beasts. Kong Wangfu. Why did he go to the Ministry of Rites? Prince Kong stood in the palace, with a suspicious look on his face. He couldn't have known that the Ministry of Rites is the territory of the Tang family. Is he going to the Tiger Mountain even though he knows there is a tiger, or is there something fishy between him and the Tang family? Someone beside him said, Your Highness, after the last incident in the Ministry of Justice, he seems to have never explained to you. King Kong looked at a middle-aged man behind him and asked, Mr. Su, what do you think? The middle-aged man was silent for a moment and said, although I don't know why Mr. Tang chose the Ministry of Rites, he never does anything in vain. There must be some purpose, but I don't know. As soon as he finished speaking, a man ran in from outside the palace and said loudly, Your Highness, there is a letter sent by Mr. Tang. After receiving the letter, King Kong opened it and glanced at it with a look of interest on his face, and murmured, Chen Zheng, the doctor of the Ministry of Rites, although he is only a small doctor, the Ministry of Rites are all from the Tang family, so he can accept for one, it's just one. After a while, the atmosphere in the hall immediately became active. It turns out that we wrongly blamed Mr. Tang. He went to the Ministry of Rites because he wanted to take action against the Tang family members in the Ministry of Rites. A piece of iron bucket from the Ministry of Rites. This time, I can make a hole in the iron bucket and come out. While everyone was talking, the middle-aged man named Su walked out of the hall and returned to his room. A young man followed him into the room. As soon as he poured him a cup of tea, he heard him sigh softly. He looked at the middle-aged man and asked doubtfully, Why do you sigh, sir? The middle-aged man looked out the window and murmured, You don't doubt what kind of person he is when you employ him. If you treat him with sincerity, he may be a big help. Otherwise, it will just be mutual use. It's a pity. In the imperial study room, Emperor Chen looked at the book handed over by a certain imperial censor, slapped it heavily on the table, and said angrily, "Chen Zheng, the doctor of the Ministry of Rites, how brave you are." Chen Zheng was a doctor in the Ministry of Rites, and the imperial examination was also among his duties. The impeachment memorial said that during the imperial examination 4 years ago, a certain candidate asked someone to take the examination on his behalf. The examination of the imperial examination was extremely strict. It would have been discovered during the physical examination, but Chen Zheng, a doctor in the Ministry of Rites, took advantage of his position and made arrangements so that his nephew, a candidate, could pass the examination on his behalf and has not been exposed so far. The imperial examination is the most important way for the country to select officials. It must be fair and impartial. Any fraud will be severely punished. The penalty for fraud is no less than the felony of murder and arson. He looked at Wei Jian and asked, "Have you found out?" Wei Jiandao, the person who took the exam, has been found. He confessed to what happened back then. The nephew of the doctor in the Ministry of Rites was sent out to become a county magistrate a year ago and has been sent to get it. Chen Zheng, Chen Huang repeated the name and asked, "Have I heard of him somewhere?" Wei Jian cupped his hands and said, "Your Majesty, Chen Zheng, the doctor in the Ministry of Rites, is the second wedding envoy selected by Tang Shangzhu." Emperor Chen threw the memorial aside and said, "Xian Tang Huai enters the palace."